Appreciate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I'd like to report back to my colleagues here in the Senate and to the American people about the results of legislation we passed here in the United States Senate and the House was signed into law by the President. We don't do that often enough. You know, we tend to pass legislation and don't do the oversight to figure out whether it's working or not. In this case, this was legislation we passed on a bipartisan basis called the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. We passed it back in April. This is legislation that allows the victims of sex trafficking to get the justice they deserve by being able to sue websites that traffic them online knowingly and to be able to have some accountability for these horrible crimes that are committed online, and then also to allow prosecutors at the state and local level to be able to prosecute these cases. We drafted the legislation because after looking at this for several years, realized that there was a rise in trafficking going on, trafficking of girls underage, trafficking of women, sometimes boys underage, and that this was increasing primarily because of the internet, kind of the dark side of the internet. You know, we're hearing a lot about what's going on the internet these days in terms of meddling in our elections and so on. Of all the positives on the internet, there's also a darker side, and we realized that this was happening online increasingly and that it was a ruthlessly efficient way to basically sell people online. So we looked at it and found out that there was a federal law that was put in place with good intentions, I believe, back a couple of decades ago to try to ensure freedom of the internet, which of course all of us support, but it provided an effective immunity to these websites, even if they were selling people online knowingly. So we wrote legislation to get at that, spent about a year trying to get that through the process and eventually got it to a vote and got it passed. The law which provided the immunity was part of the Communications Decency Act that was meant, again, to try to encourage freedom of the internet, but was taken too far, particularly in how it was interpreted by the courts. The internet was something that we had to address because without that, you would see this increase of drug trafficking and sex trafficking. So what happened? Well, after passing the law, there was a pretty dramatic change. On Monday, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown, at a place called the Change Court. The Change Court is a place where women who are incarcerated, who are trafficked and incarcerated for prostitution are able to go through a 2-year program to help them get clean, and if they're willing to go through this program, to let them walk away with a clean record. Understanding that sex trafficking is not a crime, that in effect they are victims of trafficking. And it's very inspiring to go there because in that case, I talked to about a dozen women who are currently in the program, some women who had graduated from the program, and the stories are unbelievable of women getting their lives back together, getting back to work, getting back to their families, in almost every case getting back to their children, because almost every case these are moms, and having the self-respect and dignity that comes with work and getting back with their families and getting their lives back on track. It's really a much, much better alternative than the system of throwing people into jail who are in effect victims of this trafficking and not dealing with their issues, whether it's the trauma or whether it's the drug addiction, which in almost every case of these women, there was a drug addiction issue. Almost all of them were opiate addicts or recovering addicts. One was addicted to alcohol, but this is just common. So anyway, in talking to these women, almost every one of them said the same thing, which is, yes, they had been trafficked online. And they were very interested in this legislation because, look, they've been through it. And they want to save future women and girls from having to go down this dark path. So anyway, we passed the legislation, and the SESTA legislation meant to be able to help on this issue. And I was able to tell these women at the Change Court what the results were. And they're pretty dramatic. On Monday of this week, I also met with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. That's the leading anti-trafficking group really in the country. They work day and night in trying to stop online sex trafficking. They keep track of it. They keep the statistics and the data. They particularly focus on, of course, rescuing kids from being exploited. According to NCMEC, the result since SESTA is signed into law has been swift and significant. NCMEC said, and I quote, "Since the enactment of SESTA and the government seizure of Backpage," that's Backpage.com, a website that was doing most of the commercial sex trafficking prior to our legislation, since the enactment of SESTA and the government seizure of Backpage, there has been a major disruption in the online marketplace. The robust marketplace for sex trafficking, including the sale of children for rape and sexual abuse that took a decade to build, fragmented over the course of just a few days," end quote. They also said, and I quote, "Many sites or portions of sites where NCMEC knew children previously had been sold for sex have voluntarily shut down." Their bottom line, and I quote, "This means it is much harder to purchase a child online. This means it is much harder to purchase a child online." That's great news. And that's exactly what we intended this legislation to do, to be able to save these kids and these women and sometimes boys from being subject to this horrific crime. I will tell you there's another analysis that was shared with me recently. You can find this online, but this analysis found that online ads selling women and children have been reduced since our legislation passed by between 60 and 80%, depending on the state. Between 60 and 80%, depending on the state. Dramatic change. And again, having the effect of saving literally thousands of children. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to be vigilant about this issue because, you know, when you push something down in one place, it often pops up somewhere else, doesn't it? But we have done an effective job at dealing with a very real problem. Backpage.com, which we talked about, was the industry leader. They have now been shut down. Their CEO and the company has pled guilty to numerous money laundering and trafficking-related charges. And because prosecutors can now do their work and go after these online traffickers, and because victims of this abhorrent crime can finally have their day in court, these websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking are being shut down and being held liable for their action. By the way, this never would have been possible without the work of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The staff there, the investigators, spent 2 years working on this issue, investigating it. We had to come all the way to this floor, to the chamber, in order to enforce our subpoenas to get the information which we were able to unveil that no one else had been able to find, which showed clearly that they knew what they were doing. They knew they were selling underage kids online. So I'm very proud of those investigators. I chair that subcommittee. It's bipartisan, and they do good work, and they deserve to be applauded given the results that we're now seeing. And by the way, it's not just Backpage. A lot of other classified websites have also shut down their personal ads, so-called, or sex-related operations. The issue of sex trafficking, again, we've made good progress on, but it is so related to the issue of opioid abuse. And specifically, as I said, this goes hand in hand often. Often traffickers find people who are addicted because they are vulnerable, because they crave the drug and the trafficker can provide it. But also, many times we have found in my home state of Ohio, as I've met with survivors, that they find vulnerable people who are not addicted, but then make them addicted, so they become dependent on the trafficker.